Hello, my name is Alejandra Estrin. I'm an anthropologist with Urban Anthropology Incorporated. Today, we will be talking about the Puerto Ricans or Puertorriqueños. Your anthropologist pointed out that Puerto Rico is one small nation in the Caribbean islands. Right now, I'm standing in front of Pueblo Foods, a great Puerto Rican grocery store on Milwaukee's north side. Some of their best dishes are beans and rice, and here you can buy some of the best coffee anywhere. These are major crops of Puerto Rico, but this was not always the case. For more on this, let us go back into the Puerto Rico of old. In the Cultural Connect program, you will be learning a lot about different populations and their places in history. For example, during the Middle Ages, the Mayans were ruling in Mexico. Also during the Middle Ages, the Celts were living in Ireland, and many were converting to Catholicism. At the same time, the Hmong were living in China and having a lot of problems with the Chinese. Also during the Middle Ages, the Germans lived in a large number of little kingdoms. Specifically during this time period, between about the 7th and 11th centuries, a cultural group dominated the island that would one day become known as Puerto Rico. These were the Taino Indians, a subgroup of the Arawak tribe. The Taino Indians built elaborate ballparks where they held their ceremonies. They also had a universal language, and they had a complex religious system that included a supreme creator known as Yokahu. They developed a small set of kingdoms on the island that were based on their religious system. The Tainos were skilled at raising crops such as potatoes, cassava, garlic, and many types of tropical fruit. They were also skilled sailors, fisherfolk, canoe makers, hunters, and navigators. As we move into the Renaissance period, the Tainos will have experienced change. In other areas of the world, a lot was happening. In Africa, the kingdoms of Dahomey and Ashanti were flourishing. In the United States, there was fur trade with the Indians and a time of exploration. In Mexico, there was a great kingdom of the Aztecs, and traditional learning was being revived all over Europe. But for the Taino Indians, the times were tough. In the late 1300s, a fierce South American tribe, the Caribs of the northern coast of South America, began raiding the Taino settlements. They took many slaves, especially women. Approximately 100 years later, Christopher Columbus arrived at Puerto Rico during his second voyage. He named the island San Juan Bautista after the Christian saint John the Baptist. The island was soon colonized by Spain. The Spaniards expected the Taino Indians to acknowledge the King of Spain, and by payment of gold tribute, as well as to work and supply provisions of food, and to observe the Christian ways. The Tainos rebelled, and in 1511 several chiefs conspired to oust the Spaniards. They were actually joined in the uprising by their enemies, the Caribs. But the Indian weapons were no match against the Spanish horses and firearms, and the revolt was soon ended brutally by the Spanish forces of the island's Spanish governor, Governor Juan Ponce de Leon. So what happened to the Tainos? Anthropologists have estimated that there may have been between 20,000 and 50,000 at the time of first contact with Spain. After the defeat in 1511, the Spaniards attempted to enslave the Indians and put them to work on their coffee and sugar plantations. Through maltreatment, exposure to European diseases, and intermarriage with Spaniards, who brought no women with them, these numbers were reduced to approximately 4,000 by 1515, and in 1544, a bishop only counted 60. Even though the population had nearly disappeared, the Tainos left their mark on later Puerto Rican culture. They contributed greatly to everyday life and language that had evolved during the Spanish occupation. Taino place names are still used for towns such as Hurtado, Mayagüez, Humacao, and Caguas, and many others. Many Taino homemaking and leisure time strategies were copied directly by the Europeans, including the use of straw huts and the hammock, recipes for making cassava bread, and the musical instrument known as the maracas. Many Taino words still persist in Puerto Rican vocabulary, such as names for plants and fruit. With the decimation of the Taínos, the Spaniards had to look elsewhere for slaves to work their plantations. They began to import slaves and indentured servants from Africa and Europe in the 1600s. While most of the Europeans moved to the U.S. mainland when their work contracts had ended, most of the Africans were forced to stay on as slaves. Slavery in the Caribbean islands was considered to be the harshest in history, with slaves working up to 16 hours a day in the tropical heat. The African slaves who were brought to the island carried with them cultural traits from their homelands. The Spanish colonists forced the slaves to abandon many of their cultural practices, but the slaves figured out ways to merge some of their traditional practices with those of the colonists. They developed new kinds of expressions, especially in music and religion. Most of Puerto Rico's music has roots in African rhythms and dance, but the main genres of music that have directly evolved from the African slaves are plena and bomba. Africans brought in some of their religious customs. The slaves were prohibited from worshiping in their traditional ways, so they combined their African religions with the practices of the colonists. For example, many Puerto Ricans have practiced an Afro-Caribbean religion derived from Yoruba beliefs called Santeria. Santeria means Way of the Saints. The religion focuses on trance states and is still practiced today. Some anthropologists think that another adaptation from the African past is the matrifocal family. Here, the family centers on an older woman and her daughters and grandchildren, and usually lacks permanent adult male members. This is a relatively common family form in Puerto Rico and in other Caribbean areas. Of course, the culture of Spain had a great influence on the island. Spain contributed the official language, the plantation economy, many culinary dishes, especially the rice dishes, and a great number of musical styles such as the mamba, the decima, and the danza. The Spaniards colonized the island for about 400 years, but also had trouble hanging on to Puerto Rico because of the local uprisings and threats by the other European powers. During 1898, the United States and Spain went to war. The victory by the United States ended Spain's rule in the Americas, and later that year, Spain surrendered Puerto Rico to the United States. Puerto Ricans were granted U.S. citizenship in 1917. Most modern Puerto Ricans are a mix of African and Spanish ancestry, and their current culture has been highly influenced by the Spaniards, the Taínos, and the Africans. But from 1898 on, they would also be highly influenced by the U.S. culture and economy. This has been due in part to the work contracts often offered to Puerto Ricans to come to the United States to fulfill roles that U.S. workers could not. At other times, the Puerto Ricans and other Caribbean islanders have migrated to the U.S. on their own to seek much-needed work. This is easiest for the Puerto Ricans because they are U.S. citizens. A very common migration pattern is the circular movement between the island and New York City. Most Caribbeans come to the mainland temporarily. Some males, for example, may work in New York City temporarily as taxi drivers, and then later bringing the money back home to help their children and matrifocal families. These circular migration patterns benefit New York City and other mainland areas in big ways. Most Caribbeans work for relatively low wages. Puerto Rican and Dominican women have actually kept the garment industry in New York City from moving elsewhere. Other Caribbean women work as child caretakers and domestic servants so that the permanent New York residents can pursue professional careers. But not all Puerto Ricans had wanted to return to Puerto Rico. Many have settled permanently in the United States. By the middle of the 20th century, more began moving further inland, and some came to areas such as Chicago and Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, some businesses such as the Grady Foundry began recruiting Puerto Ricans from other U.S. and Puerto Rican areas. Several thousand Puerto Ricans had originally settled in an area just north of downtown Milwaukee that your anthropologist had pointed out earlier. They developed their own tightly knit neighborhood and businesses in that area, but the housing stock was pretty bad. And for this reason, the city of Milwaukee decided to tear down the area with the help of the Urban Renewal Program. The city also decided to use the rest of this area to construct the Park East Freeway. I'll bet some of you remember another community that was displaced by the urban renewal and freeway projects. Where did this Puerto Rican community end up? Well, most ended up moving into the River West neighborhood, where they've been reestablishing their community. On any given evening in River West, one can see the Puerto Rican families playing a favorite game, dominoes, on their front porches. Or one can watch the kids playing baseball in the parks, or stop in at a local club to hear any genre of Puerto Rican music, or watch their religious processions during special holidays, like Good Friday. It is now time to return to your anthropologist and work on the questions that were set up for you. Well, I'm back. I hope that you've given some serious thought to the questions that you were given on the Puerto Rican community. Now you will hear their own ideas in their own words.
In a Milwaukee study conducted by local cultural anthropologists, Latinos of various national backgrounds were interviewed about the cultural traditions, practices, and ideas they brought with them to the United States. Some of the traditions, practices, and ideas that emerged as most prominent included economic pursuits, family relations, religious and healing practices, and expressive culture. The U.S. government and businesses have a long history of recruiting Latinos to work in the U.S. when the local citizenry could not meet labor needs. These transactions range from recruiting Central Americans to work in coffee factories in the late 1800s, to farm labor programs, to railroad building, to war industry jobs during World War II, to tanneries in Milwaukee. In many cases, the Latino workforce has sustained the highly competitive position of the U.S. in the world economy. For example, ethnic scholars such as Sutton and Cheney point out to the essential role of Caribbeans in the success of New York City. Puerto Rican and Dominican women have effectively kept the garment industry in New York from moving elsewhere. The willingness of Caribbeans to work in service jobs in hotels, the transportation industry, and restaurants has helped New York remain the tourist capital of the world. Latino workers have come to this country with a variety of skills, depending in part on the areas of origin and to an even larger extent on their social class status.
In 1949, we had a governor by the name of Luis Muñoz Marin who created a series of operations, is what he called them, for Puerto Rico. One of the first things he did was he created a division of community education where he made sure everybody was able to read and write. People in Puerto Rico are 94.4 literate. It means that 94% of the population can read and write. There are 14 public institutions of higher education and 54 private ones. So education is a big thing in Puerto Rico.
Unfortunately, at times even the best work ethic and education have failed to help Latinos overcome barriers. It is often the strength of family ties that has helped Latinos of all backgrounds cope with barriers and change. Ethnic researchers such as Marin and Marin have studied Latino immigrants and stressed the strength of attachments to their nuclear and extended families. Latino families from all national origins tend to be cohesive, inclusive, and interdependent.
Puerto Rican families tend to stay together, not only the central family, but also the extended family, like the grandparents. Sometimes the younger adults don't leave the home until they're married, and sometimes after they're married and divorced, they come back and live in the home. So Puerto Rico has always had that tradition of the extended families. When there's a wedding or a big event in the family, or even a death, the extended family comes together. So it means that the uncles and the aunts and the nephews and everybody is part of that family. They all stick together. They also include their compadres, and compadres are the godparents of their children. They also become part of that extended family.
Puerto Rico is a small island. So people tend to come here and everyone's related. They come and settle in particular groups, and they bring all their family and their family's family and all their friends. And we're all cousins somehow. The Garcias are related to the Berrios, and the Crespos are related to someone else. So we're all related some way.
Latinos of all backgrounds also practice strong respect for their elders, and grandmothers tend to have special statuses in the family. However, family structures are not always the same across Latino subgroups. For example, a common family form seen throughout the Caribbean is the matrifocal unit, where family life centers around an older woman and her daughters and grandchildren. Some anthropologists, such as Melville Herskovitz, tried to show how this family form may have been carried over by West African slaves, where multiple wives in a household maintained their own residences. Other anthropologists see this as an adaptation to the experience of slavery in the Caribbean, where men were often deprived of control over their wives and children. The household and the family forms also influence gender relations, particularly among new immigrants.
The machismo culture exists in most Latino cultures. However, in the Puerto Rican culture, it's the mother or the grandmother, whether it's on the paternal side or the maternal side, that tend to be the focus and tend to be the decision makers in the family. Even if they allow the men to believe that they're making the decisions, it's definitely the matriarch who makes the decisions.
Another unifying force for most Latinos has been the Catholic Church. 6 of 7 Latinos in the U.S. are Catholic, and nationally, they make up over 1/3 of all U.S. Catholics. Religious orientation also influences settlement patterns of Latinos here. In Milwaukee, the largest group of Latinos live on the near South Side, an area originally settled by Polish and other Eastern European communities. A smaller group of primarily Puerto Rican Latinos also live on Milwaukee's near Northeast Side, an area also settled primarily by Poles, as well as African Americans and a few members of other cultural groups. During the early days of Latino immigration, Spanish-speaking worshipers were often relegated to church basements. This allowed many of their cultural-specific practices to continue. The healing practices that Latinos of diverse origins brought to the U.S. are related directly and indirectly to their local religious traditions.
Growing up in Puerto Rico, sometimes we didn't have the money to go out and get prescription drugs. So it was up to my grandmother to go out in the backyard and pick up some medicinal plants and create some type of elixir, I would say.
My mother believes in natural healing. She believes in all the teas and everything you can put in the tea, and the powers of ginger and the powers of prayer and the powers of what is known as Santeria and the powers to the different saints and the different virgins and the rosaries. And they turn to those kind of healing practices before it actually turned to what we here call professional medical advice.
Over time, many Milwaukee Latinos have been influenced by U.S. healthcare practices, but the cultural-specific cures and more inclusive views on medicine persist in Latino neighborhoods. Most Anglos are familiar with Latino expressive culture, from the warmth of Latino personal interaction, to language, to art, to food, to music. One element of expressive culture that is seen among Latinos of all backgrounds is the intimacy of social life.
Latinos, especially Puerto Rican, do not have a personal space, and that is shown when you go to a reunion or a place where the Puerto Ricans, they hug and kiss, and it doesn't mean anything more than "I'm so glad to see you." So while other cultures have this personal space where they feel uncomfortable when people get close to them, we don't have that.
On the surface, language would appear to be another unifying factor among Latinos of various national origins. But this is not entirely the case. Even where Spanish is commonly spoken, variation abounds.
Many people in the Mexican culture will use one particular word that will have an absolute different meaning to the Puerto Rican culture, and the same in Venezuela, Argentina.
Most Puerto Ricans like to speak really fast. So they'll be talking to me in Spanish and somebody will turn to me and says, "What did he say?" And I say, "I have no idea. I didn't understand him. He was talking too fast for me. I'll catch a word here and there, you know."
Similarities and differences in expressive culture can be seen in leisure time practices such as games, art, food preparation, and music. For example, while Latinos are competitive in sports everywhere, games of choice vary. The love of soccer is a uniting force among so many Latinos due mainly to the Spanish influence. But baseball rules in the Latino Caribbean areas due mainly to U.S. influence. Likewise with fine arts. Latinos of all backgrounds have used art to convey social and political messages. But artistic styles vary. Again with Latino cuisine, Latino dishes are known everywhere for their rich flavor. But culinary styles vary from region to region. For example, Mexicans have historically favored corn as a staple food, while Caribbean Latinos favored rice, and South Americans favored wheat and potatoes. And not all Latino dishes are hot. For example, cooks from the Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Puerto Rico use more oregano, garlic, and tomatoes to flavor food rather than chiles. Once again with music, Latinos from all regions express themselves through music and dance.
Caribbean music for us as a culture is very important because everything that is done as far as family gatherings or events in the neighborhood or wherever we live pretty much revolves around the rhythms that came to us from Africa.
However, the musical styles are extremely varied with scores of different genres, ranging from African Caribbean pompa and plena to Colombian cumbia, to Brazilian samba and bossa nova, to Mexican rancheras and polcas norteñas.
The music is wonderful. You have the Cuban music, you have the Dominican music, the Puerto Rican music, the Mexican music, and it's very different in terms of the instruments that are used, the rhythm that it's used, but it's all very lively and you hear it everywhere you go in the city.
Well, were you right? Did you figure out some of the answers to your questions? We'll talk a bit more about the Puerto Rican contributions later. I'm back. I hope you all did well at your exercises. Now I'm going to talk for a couple of minutes about the wonderful contributions that Puerto Rican Americans have made to the United States and to Milwaukee. Despite being such a small population, their contributions have been exceptional. Your anthropologist will pass around some photos. Some Puerto Ricans living in the United States you will immediately recognize, such as music stars Jennifer Lopez and Mark Antony. You might even recognize this Oscar-winning actress Rita Moreno. I'll bet many of you have heard of the actor Jimmy Smits of The West Wing or seen reruns of SWAT with Bruce Gray. For the sports fans, Many baseball stars in the United States have a Puerto Rican background. Some major stars include Sandy Alomar, Jr. and Sr., Orlando Cepeda, Roberto Clemente, Felix Mantilla, and Jaime Navarro. Felix Mantilla played for the Milwaukee Braves, and Jaime Navarro played for the Milwaukee Brewers. A Puerto Rican boxer named Alberto Mercado represented the United States in the Olympics. But there are more contributions than just Puerto Rican celebrities living in the United States. For example, a Puerto Rican woman, Deidre Connolly, is president of Eli Lilly, the giant pharmaceutical company. There are many Puerto Rican scientists involved in the American space program and NASA. In 2004, Joseph Acaba became the first Puerto Rican to become an astronaut candidate. In 2004 as well, Dr. Nitza Margarita Cintron was named Chief of NASA's Johnson Space Center of Medicine and Healthcare Systems Office. And we surely experienced a share of tasty Puerto Rican dishes. So many of our best espressos are made with Puerto Rican coffee. Many of us have enjoyed rice and beans Puerto Rican style. Other wonderful dishes are arroz guisado, a rice stew seasoned with sofrito, which is a blend of spices such as cilantro, recao, which is a type of cilantro, onions, green peppers, and other non-spicy ingredients. Rice with gandules, or green pigeon peas, is a favorite dish of many people, and others are wild about fried plantains. Now you know just some of the contributions that Puerto Rican Americans have made, and you know that other Latinos have made tremendous contributions as well. Let us see how much you can remember when you compete for baseball cards in Jeopardy!